Hi there, and welcome to the Markets UK podcast with me, Nick Shepley, bringing you a quick burst of politics, history, economics, and analysis. Now, to all those who were old enough to remember having wooden rulers at school with the kings and queens of England on the back, this post is going to be a treat, assuming, of course, you enjoyed the 1066 and all that version of events. I'm going to forward this post to George Osborne and strongly recommend that he takes a leaf or two out of Henry VII's book. By 1485, England had suffered 3 decades of dynastic civil war, commonly termed the Wars of the Roses. Power had shifted back and forth between rival branches of the Plantagenets, loosely divided into the families of York and Lancaster. Even though most of the violence had been contained to the battlefield and had not spilled over to the massacre of civilians, it had brought chaos and weakness to the country. The final Yorkist king, Richard III, had come to power through subterfuge and murder, particularly the murders of his nephews, the 2 heirs to the throne, and in his 2.5-year rule he was very unpopular. His unspeakable crimes were only part of the reason for his unpopularity. The real reason was his decision to ship nobles from his power base in York to take up the best government jobs and titles in the south, offending the nobility in London and causing them to conspire against him. Richard, for all his cunning, had not come to understand the political reality of the day and the overriding reason for such a long period of unrest. The nobles were in charge of the country, not the crown. Under Edward IV and Henry VI, who had ruled before Richard came to power, the nobles had gone unchecked in their acquisition of power and had little or no incentive to conform to the wishes of the king. Regular readers of this blog may be able to detect where I'm going with all of this. The 2 men were weak, and Henry VI appears to have in his reign to have had some sort of nervous breakdown, and for some period of his reign to have been in a coma. This lack of strength manifested itself in a willingness to appease the nobility and to grant them wealth, titles, and most importantly, land. Land was the great wealth creator in the Middle Ages. Anyone with enough of it could rise to positions of great power, and the crown only functioned when it had sufficient private income from land to put it head and shoulders in power over everybody else. Henry and Edward ignored these simple lessons, and the nobility forgot its place. They were able to build private armies. Their men, called retainers, began to wear the livery not of the king, but of the feudal lord, showing that their first loyalty was to the master that paid their wages and not to the king himself. England in the Middle Ages didn't have a standing army, and so the king, in times of war with France or the Scots, had to go cap in hand to the nobles to provide him with troops. As these private armies grew, their masters had ever greater contempt for the crown and eyed the throne hungrily. Richard did nothing to undo any of this, not recognising that breaking the power of the nobles was essential for his continued survival. Meanwhile, angry nobles with a sense of entitlement were crossing the Channel to France to meet with young Henry Tudor, the only man who had any claim on the throne of England. Henry Tudor had lived in France in exile since he was a boy. His uncle Jasper took him there to keep him safe when, as a result of the wars, other heirs to the throne died out. Henry was inexperienced in statecraft, but knew that he could only beat Richard on the battlefield if Richard's own side turned against him. And so he promised to end the Wars of the Roses by uniting York and Lancaster when he won. When Henry met Richard in open combat at the Battle of Bosworth, Richard's trusted lieutenant, the Earl of Stanley, and many of his knights crossed over to Henry's side, enabling him to win and costing Richard his life. Henry Tudor, crowned Henry VII, did bring peace and order to England, and he managed to do it without further bloodshed, and he did it through cutting the overmighty nobles down to size. He returned lands to the crown by waiting for noble lines to die out, allowing their lands to return to the crown and not issuing any more titles. He heavily fined and taxed nobles who stepped out of line, and banned them from keeping private armies. In popular legend we see Henry as a dull, miserly king, and perhaps this is due to the fact that his son, Henry VIII, was a flamboyant, egomaniac spendthrift. The reality was that Henry brought order back to a society that had been bent out of shape by the power of one vested interest group. And that's where we return to the present day. Our overmighty nobles stride the globe, impervious to the rule of law and too big to fail. They use their vast wealth to insulate themselves from the societies that sustain them, and they are not just legally but morally unfettered. They are, of course, the banks, the financial institutions that have a monopoly over our money, the lifeblood of the financial system. The governments of the world were presented with their own post-Bosworth moment in 2008 and chose not to pursue it. Instead, they continued to tell us that banks were vital job creators and must be cherished. Imagine explaining to the ordinary folk of the 15th century about how vital to their well-being the local robber baron was. Quite. Well, 518 years have passed, and if the mentality of our leaders isn't anywhere near as forthright and single-minded as Henry VII's was, the technology certainly has improved. Even a couple of decades ago, we were vastly more dependent on large institutions for our information. We trusted them a lot more to manage our wealth, and we assumed that banks, governments, and bureaucracies were staffed with rational, honest, and public-spirited types. We had to believe all these things because we had no choice not to. But since 2008, almost no one labours under these delusions any longer. Now there are alternatives. There are options that can not only bring the banks back to heel if we use them, but they can help to create a new economic model, one where individual investors can dictate their own futures and protect themselves from the arbitrary decisions of remote, unaccountable elites. Our elected leaders may not pay any attention to Henry VII, but we ignore his lessons at our peril. And you've been listening to me, Nick Shepley, for the Markets UK podcast. Thank you very much.